Thank you all again for joining us. Welcome to webinar number 6 in this series called Meet the HyValue Research Partners. In this open webinar series, you will get the chance to get to know each HyValue research partner organization a bit better, including getting a taste of their ongoing research activities within the energy transition, with particular focus on hydrogen-related research and capabilities. HyValue is a Norwegian research center on hydrogen energy carriers, facilitating technology developments, education, and building new knowledge to make possible, sustainable, and competitive hydrogen value chains in Norway and abroad. The center is funded for a period of up to 8 years until 2030, supported by the Research Council of Norway, including funding from many dedicated partners across different areas of industries, public sector, and academia. You can read more about HyValue on the website hyvalue.no. There you can also find our previous recorded webinars in this series. Today's webinar is hosted by the Institute of Transport Economics, with headquarters in Oslo. The webinar will include several presentations, including questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So please write your questions to the presenters in the chat, and we will facilitate a question and answer session at the end. And with that, we will get started with the program. So first speaker is Bjørne Grimsrud. He's going to talk about TØI and TØI's energy transition research. So Bjørne, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having this opportunity to present TØI. I am heading this research organization, and I'm very pleased for TØI to be a part of this very interesting and needed research network and the research activity on hydrogen. I'm just going to briefly present who are we at TØI. We are an independent non-profit research foundation established in 1964, so we 60 years this year, and based mainly from coming from social science, but very interdisciplinary contract research. Means that we have employees with a very different background, but mainly social science. And that we are contract researchers. That means that we are, in practical, we need to we are based on the different customers that buy our research services. But of course, public funding like this is a main resource, of course. We are 108 employees. 80 plus researchers, actually 90 plus, but 80 researchers full time, and we are organized in 4 different departments, which you see here. Department of Mobility, and which looks at the very many reasons why we travel and understanding the pattern of traveling. Department of Economics, which traditionally works with all this modeling of transport and predictions of future transport. Department of Safety and Security, traditionally, of course, very much of road safety, but also safety in a wider perspective, and resilience and how to develop a safety culture in what you are doing. And then our news department of Technology Analysis and Innovation, looking into different new technology coming into the transport sector, which is a lot, but also looking at the technology for research, for our research, like artificial intelligence, and helping to develop, and that's happening quite rapidly, develop our methodology and way of working as researchers, and also looking into how to help businesses in innovation, and what's drive innovation, and actually what are the obstacles of innovation. I'm not going to say very much about different activities. We will have more presentations later, but I will, in this context, just sort of emphasize two things about the Institute of Transport Economics. The one is that we in very much of our research, and historically and today, is directed towards giving knowledge and advice to decision makers in the transport sector. So a lot of our research are of use as background or basis for example, regulations or strategies or long-term time planning inside the transport sector. And that's, of course, important input also in a program like this. And the other is over sort of emphasize on, which I just mentioned, on innovation and innovation along the whole value chain. And we are looking at what we will say the non-technical barriers to innovation, and which is of course quite a number of barriers, but that's what we often contribute to in collaboration when we are working together with technical institutes. We are very often looking into the obstacles and or the opportunities in seen from the business perspective. That's what I would like to say about TØI this morning, and looking forward to the rest of the presentations, and also to all the cooperation that we will have with all the different partners within HyValue in the future. So we are very happy to be part of the program, and happy to be able to present ourselves this morning. So I'll turn back to Jonas. Yeah.
Thank you, Bjørne. We then move over to Chirag George. He's going to present about public perception of hydrogen fuel in Norwegian transport. So please, Chirag. You can unmute. That would be good.
That would be good. Thank you all for being here. Today, we will be talking about the social barriers, in particular, public perception of hydrogen fuel in Norwegian transport. And Bjørne's last comment is actually quite relevant to this. My field is within innovation studies, and within that, I use something called the socio-technical transitions perspective. This subfield within innovation studies looks at broad historical changes in the way society uses technology, and it views these changes not as just changes in technology, but also changes in consumer practices, policies, cultural meanings, infrastructures, and businesses. So basically, what are the non-technical aspects of innovation that are important? And two prominent cases that help illustrate the sorts of subjects that are studied would be the transition from sail shipping to steam shipping, or the transition from horse and carriage to automobiles. And in recent years, these sort of broad analyses have focused on ways to achieve sustainability in critical fields such as transportation. And that's sort of what is at the core of my work that I've been working on the past few years. Why do we care about hydrogen? I don't need to go into detail about this since we are all working with hydrogen, but effectively it is the prospects of having a zero emission fuel for the transport sector, which accounts for about 1/4 of emissions in Europe at the moment. What I'd like to begin with here, I guess, is just an importance of the Norwegian context. And I won't go into detail on these, but it's worth mentioning the industrial heritage of hydrogen in Norway, large-scale production going back about a century. Secondly, you also have a large natural gas resource base, which can be used for large-scale hydrogen production. Similarly, point 3, you also have a large renewable base, which can be used for the production of hydrogen. So Norway is doubly blessed in terms of production capacity. Another thing that is important with respect to Norway is that it is generally a first adopter country, and this isn't restricted just to transportation, but in technology in general. Norwegians have often been at the forefront of technological adoption, even if these are innovations that come from other parts of the world. Another thing is geographic distances. As we discuss the electrification of the vehicle fleet, one of the large barriers to that is the distances that must be traveled and serve as a barrier to the adoption of battery electric vehicles in many instances, and hydrogen may be particularly relevant for that. But by far, the most interesting thing about Norway in terms of my research is the 2019 explosion of a refueling station outside of Oslo. And we look at some of the ways in which this explosion may have influenced public perception, willingness to use and tolerate hydrogen in their environment. What we did is we made a survey, nationally representative, over 2,000 participants, about a year and a half after the explosion. And what we wanted to do here was ensure that we're not putting a lot of ideas in the participants' minds. So we did not want to make this a hydrogen survey and ask, are you scared of hydrogen? Because that is quite a leading question. So the survey was actually structured as a comparative survey of alternative fuels and powertrains for transportation. So participants were given a range of questions about hydrogen, battery, petrol, diesel, and natural gas options. And we were most interested in the hydrogen, but all powertrains were included within this so as to present it in a more neutral manner. Part 2 of the survey, participants were told that they would be given specific questions about one of the alternative drivetrains. In fact, what happened is every single participant was given hydrogen questions. And here we were able to ask some more detailed questions specifically about hydrogen. There's a lot of factors that we were interested in, but because certain choices we made, we did not go into elements of aspects of the green, blue, gray production methodology, gas, liquid, or ammonia. We didn't get into willingness to pay or even economic development, distriktspolitikk, that sort of thing. We were mostly concerned with awareness of hydrogen, perceived sustainability, and perceived safety risks. So what did we find? In terms of awareness, how familiar were people with different types of vehicles? Well, battery electric vehicles, you had a pretty good response in terms of how aware people were, and very low with respect to FCEV, that's the fuel cell electric vehicles, and vehicles that use biofuels. So we see here very low level of stated knowledge of hydrogen fuel vehicles. And this is unsurprising given that there were max 200 vehicles at any given point in Norway, whereas the fleet is enormous for battery electric vehicles. But perhaps what's a bit more interesting for me is this one here. When asked which of these statements are true here, whether fuel cell electric vehicles have a combustion engine, an electric motor, or both a combustion and electric motor, well, 12% said that it had an electric motor, 25% said that it had a combustion, and 16% said that it had both combustion and an electric motor. This is a very small percentage of people that know that a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is in fact an electric vehicle. And in terms of discourse, we felt that this was important in terms of how hydrogen vehicles are framed. And sure, there is we can't equate hydrogen vehicles with battery electric vehicles, but in terms of how it is perceived, I think there's a lot to be discussed there, especially given the fact that 47% of the respondents claimed simply they don't know. Perceived sustainability. In general, fuel cell electric vehicles are considered or were considered environmentally friendly, but not as much as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles. And what's interesting here is the very large percentage of respondents, about a third, that either did not answer or stated that they do not know in terms of its sustainability. But still, we had more than half say that it was somewhat or much more environmentally friendly than petrol-driven cars. Similarly, we asked to what extent governments should support the purchase and use of these vehicles. And once again, we see here that nearly half of the respondents supported the government support for fuel cell vehicles, which was less than for plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles. So that is promising, but at the same time, we have once again about a third of respondents saying, I don't know. This is the big one here. We asked how concerned people would be about a fire or explosion as a passenger on the following types of buses. We asked about buses, but actually we were interested about ferries. But we didn't ask ferries because there were many people we figured that do not regularly take ferries. We wanted to make it a bit more relatable. What we see here is that the fear of fire or explosion was actually highest for hydrogen fuel cell buses. We have more than 40% would be some levels of concern for fire, and similar amounts, slightly more, for concern for explosion on a hydrogen bus. This was somewhat surprising because in the literature, you had a sort of dichotomy prior to this, where hydrogen was listed as one of the volatile fuels that could explode, whereas batteries are often cited as potential fire hazards. But here we see that our respondents were actually more concerned about fire on a hydrogen bus than a battery electric bus. Moving on here, we also asked about how safe people would feel living next to a station. We asked this because the societal acceptance of a fuel is not just about whether people use it in their own vehicles or in their own transport, but whether or not they are willing to tolerate it within their environment. And here we see, once again, that hydrogen has the least level of tolerance or the most amount of feeling unsafe. But here, it's also important to note that there is a high level of uncertainty with about a quarter of respondents saying that they don't know, and more than half actually saying that they would feel safe here. So this is not a very high level of fear, we believe. But we also asked in the specific questions about hydrogen, the most important thing I think here to take away is that is the second to last one here. In terms of safety, hydrogen is better suited for use by professional operators than in passenger cars. This suggests that people are somewhat more willing to accept hydrogen in transport if it is operated in a fleet with professional drivers who have training in how to use this fuel. But as you can see in all of these, you have about half or more of the respondents simply stating, I don't know, which is to say the narrative has not been set yet. And this is basically the last one here. We did some statistical analysis to see how awareness of the 2019 explosion affected people's fear levels. And the 3 stars here are next to what I feel are the most important variables here. Prior knowledge of fuel cell electric vehicles. If you knew more about hydrogen from beforehand, you are much less likely to be scared of hydrogen. Proximity to the explosion. This was somewhat surprising. There was a lack of significant relationship. So there was even a slightly positive association between proximity. So the closer you were to the explosion, and this wasn't significant though, the closer you were, the less fear you had. And thirdly, this is unsurprising, perhaps the least surprising part of the analysis, the more aware you were about the explosion, the more scared you were about it. And this was a very, very significant relationship. We're still digging through this, and there's still literature that's going to be coming out from TOI on this with respect to this, but that's all for now. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Very interesting presentation. We have to move forward, and the next speaker is Ingrid Sundvor, going to present movement analysis of vessels. Ingrid, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I will present work that mainly myself and my colleague Rebecca have been working on lately. The starting point is that today, more or less all vessels have IS responder, and we can retrieve data. And this gives us a lot of possibilities for interesting analysis, and main data is position data and speed, etc., meaning that we can do a lot of interesting stuff related to where the vessel goes, where they stop, etc. And for this need, we have developed an in-house model which we call ASEAM, the IS Emission and Energy Model, and this is the main focus for my presentation. I will say a little bit about the background for the development, and then I go into more detail about the model with some examples of the use, and I will finish off with summarizing a bit of the projects where we've used the model. So this work started in another FME, Moses, with the case study performed by IFE, where they looked in very detailed on one high-speed passenger vessel for conversion of hydrogen fuel cell power. And then the question was that how about scaling this up for all high-speed passenger vessels in Norway, and that task was given to us. So to be able to do that, we needed a model, and that's the birth of our model ASEAM. So we did scale up and applied this for all registered high-speed passenger vessels in Norway. So this resulted in a paper, which you can read more about the results there, but I will give some examples, cases from the result from this. I will go a bit more in detail on the different levels of the models, but just first an overview. We have, of course, different kinds of data needed to do our analysis. And then the main model, it's quite modular, so we can pick and choose what kind of parts we are interested to, according to the case we're interested in. And some of the main input is, of course, general movement analysis, and also more detailed on harbor-to-harbor movements and speed power profiles, for instance. When we're talking about passenger vessels, of course, the route in public services are of interest. And also, this is an energy and emission model, so we also get results on emissions. So a little bit about the data. This is an IS model, so of course the main data is IS, and the main data we use is the position and speed. This is high resolution data with varying timestamps, so typically resolution is by 2 to 10 seconds. From this, we can do, of course, the movement analysis, but if we want to look into more like energy and emissions, we also need other ship data. For instance, very important motor power and other characteristics of the vessel. Other data which might come of use is, for instance, as I said, we have been looking at high-speed passenger vessels that are operating on public services, and then to having route information, where they stop, the sequence of stop, and how all these routes varies is very useful. We also can take use of a lot of different geodata. Just some examples like coastline, offshore installation, and municipality board data, which are important to match and to get interesting results. We also have a possibility to connect with weather data. We have this in place, but so far we have not been using this information in the energy estimate, but this is a possibility for future projects. So a little bit of how we do parts of the model. If, for instance, one is how to actually identify where the harbors are, where they stop. We then use low speed data points where we cluster them, and then we can filter out unknown harbors, for instance, to have more information about the locations, or to filter out falsely stops or stops at sea by using distance from coastline. When we have the harbors, we can then split all the movements into harbor to harbor path. And one of the interests, as is shown in the figure, is just the speed profile between two harbors, which can give a lot of interesting information. And we also get how much time they spend at each harbor, so arriving and leaving times at the harbor. And of course, the order of these harbor visits can be a route, which we then can also, all these movements, we can split into the routes or trips, depending on either going from one harbor to coming back to the same harbor, or how much time they spend in a specific harbor. So when we do this, for instance, here is an example from a route from Kristiansund to Trondheim and back. When we split this, we can also compare them with timetable, also as a quality control of our method. When it comes to energy calculation, for the high-speed passenger vessels, we did receive speed power curves directly from BrødreneAa, which is the builder. And for other vessels, we use adapted cubic law. I will not go into detail, but just to say that the most important here is, of course, the speed data and the registered speed, together with the motor power. So here is an example of results applying the model for our Norwegian flagged high-speed passenger vessels, where we've taken out the daily energy. And an interesting perspective here is, of course, the large variation in the daily energy for these vessels. This can indicate, or the interest in this study was also to see which vessels might be most likely to be converted or replaced by zero-emission vessels. So their daily energy need might say something about which vessels or which might be most suitable for battery electric or hydrogen electric vessels. Having the energy, we also can see the variation of the energy use in time and also space. So here we also have plotted the daily energy for all these vessels per weekday. And this, as this was high-speed passenger vessels, also operating for public transport, we see that typically there are lower activities in the weekends, especially on Saturdays. If we now combine these two, both the energy and the locations of the harbors, we can allocate this energy need to the harbors. So here is an example where we've taken the daily energy, allocated all this energy to the stop with the longest for each vessel per day. And this indicates that there are some major hubs, but there are also some energy need in small locations. This interest of this is, of course, if you have zero-emission transport, where should they refuel? Where should you have charging infrastructure? If you keep the today's activities and movements. So where you allocate this energy is not the same as where they actually are visiting, which harbors are most visiting. So this can vary. So that's some of the taste of what the model can do and how it been used. We have several ongoing projects and where we have applied the AC model. As I said, Moses is where the initial development started with high-speed passenger vessels. We also have an ongoing project where we also look at passenger vessels, but then also slower speeding. There, the main focus is route and public transport. We also have an interesting project on called FAME on fishing and aquaculture vessels, where we also are interested in the zero emission technology possibilities for these vessels. And this model, of course, is continuously developing, and according to the project, we always have new interesting developments to look into. We also have done a similar study for bulk vessels, where also then this allocating the energy need to the harbors were of interest, where IFE further took this further to look into infrastructure needs. And then HyValue, where we also are planning to apply the model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Very interesting. And if people are interested in movement analysis of vessels, please take contact with Ingrid. Next one out is Kenneth Løvold Røseth, going to present a planning of hydrogen value chain for high-speed passenger services in Nordland. Kenneth, floor is yours.
Thank you. So this is a work that is based on the master thesis by Berke Borgmoen Pein that were supervised by myself and Kjetil Fagerholt at NTNU. So this work is based on the same project that Ingrid talked about, the SEBS project, where we look at high-speed vessel services. But Ingrid's work that's here belonging to work package 1, well, this work is it belongs to work package 4, where we look more on the planning of the transport system with zero-emission high-speed vessel services. So that means routing and scheduling decisions for vessels, more or less. So when we started out the work package 4, we focused more on battery-powered vessels and the planning of these for a given route. But then with the new requirements for zero emissions for high-speed vessels from 2025, we wanted to focus more on the planning at the transport, at the regional level for a given transport system, rather than focusing only on a given route. And then, as the previous study that Ingrid talked about show, when we want to plan for multiple connections or services, hydrogen becomes an important solution, because okay, you can apply these battery powered vessels, but they have range limitation, and hydrogen needs to come in and fill the gap. So basically what we have done is to extend our planning models for high-speed vessel services to accommodate both the selection between what kind of services should use battery-powered vessels and where do we need to have hydrogen. And also what we're interested in as part of this problem is to understand the value chain for hydrogen. Where should it be produced? Should it be produced locally, or should it be a centralized production with distribution? And should there be economies of scale also in the refueling of vessels, in the sense that should multiple services share a refueling point? So these are kind of decisions that we want to model as part of our overall problem. So we have here, so the objective of our problem is to minimize the system cost, both for the transport system in terms of choosing the fleet and the number of vessels and type of vessels that operate the transport system. But at the same time, we also want to consider decisions for the energy system. So where do we produce hydrogen, and how do we distribute it, more or less? So all these decisions are included in our problem. I just wanted to highlight those that are more linked with the energy production side. So what the models select, so this is a dynamic model, so it also chooses when to install an infrastructure type and where to install it. a set of candidate locations in Nordland in our particular problem. And of course, we also need to consider whether the grid must be expanded, which is also a cost of installing or going into these zero emission solutions. And in terms of operational decisions, we also talk about how much energy is being produced in terms of hydrogen production. In principle, we have here the possibilities for the different routes in Nordland to use different types of infrastructure and energy carriers. So we have a battery swap system, we have battery charging, and then we have two types of hydrogen infrastructure. So we either have the local, we have the centralized hub with distribution to refueling stations at a given port, or we have local production of hydrogen at the given site at the port. So these are the options that we consider in our model. And I just want to give a brief explanation about the model, because this is a dynamic model, as I said. And basically what we want to do is to introduce a more and more stricter carbon requirement. So the carbon emissions from the sector is required to decrease and eventually become zero over time in our modeling. And what the model does is to make optimal investments in vessels and also refueling infrastructure and energy producing infrastructure. So this is just a very simple example where we have here 4 different routes, and you have the triangle that indicates where you can bunker or charge the vessels, and then you have the squares that indicates the vessels, and then the color codes here means the type of energy carrier. So in the time step 1, we start off with everything in sort of red color, which indicates here conventional vessel. So that's the diesel vessel, and now the model is making investment. And then in this system, we make an investment in a given period, and then it becomes the investment. Say you invest in a battery powered vessel, then that becomes available in the next period. So there's a lag between the investment and the use of a vessel. So here in this example, we have the pink investment here that indicates a battery powered vessel and charging facility. So that becomes available in time step 2. And then there's no further investments until time step 3, where the model invests in a hydrogen, the yellow color, the hydrogen refueling point and production point, and also hydrogen vessels. So they become then available in time step 4. And then at the same time, in time step 4, you invest in 1 additional hydrogen vessel. And then in time step 5, we have had a complete transition from a diesel system to a zero emission system where you have charging for one of the routes, and then you have hydrogen use for the other routes. But what is interesting in time step 4, you can see that the route that is located south in this picture, it has no bunkering options at the site within the route. So it needs to detour, it needs to go to somewhere else that is indicated by these pink arrows to refuel. So this is what we want to model specifically in a model, whether we can co-localize bunkering infrastructure for hydrogen. So a given service will have this utility of having to go to a remote location to bunker, and we take into account all these disadvantage costs related to that. But maybe for the system as a whole, to have a more efficient value chain, it's important to exploit these economies of scale, not only in production, but also in terms of bunkering of hydrogen. So that's also what we try to model. So what we do is to take this and we implement this to the high-speed ferry connections in Nordland. There are in total 19 of them, and then we do this scenario analysis where over the course of some years we approach a zero emission transport system. So this figure here, so now I'm just briefly going through the results. This figure here shows the number of vessels and what kind of vessel types the model selects for this transition to zero emission from 2023, which is the current system. And you can see here you have everything in brown, which kind of indicates that these are diesel vessels. So I have this code here, C, that means conventional vessel, that means diesel, and everything in 2023 is diesel in the current system. But then everything changes when we approach this year 2038. Then in 2038, the model, or we require the model to select a zero emission system for all services in Nordland. So you can see that the transition here is somewhat slow in the beginning, but then something happened here in 2029. And what happens first is that you start investing in battery charging and battery swap infrastructures. So our interpretation of this is, of course, that these battery systems are much more energy efficient than the hydrogen system. So you will opt for going to these systems first. But once you kind of reach this limit of the range limit of battery powered vessels, then you are sort of forced to make the investments in hydrogen if you want to go full-fledged zero emission. So that is what happens here. So the yellow color vessels in AXA thing, that so the code here just means H, that's hydrogen, and the numbers here indicate the size of the vessel in terms of passenger carrying capacity. And you can see that the majority of vessels in 2038 are hydrogen. So hydrogen is, so in Nordland they have a very long and complex connections. And if you want to go zero emission, you are sort of, at least when you have the options that we have in our model, which are battery charging or a hydrogen vessel, you are forced to go to the hydrogen vessel if you want to have a complete transition. And then we look a bit about where should we install different infrastructures for either refueling or charging. So of course this is not so easy to interpret without any context, but I will just point out two main takeaways from this. First of all, we look at this, the trade-off between local production and centralized production with hydrogen. What this model has selected is to have a centralized production in Bodø with a transport to or distribution of hydrogen to other locations. So the yellow dots here, they are refueling stations that are served with or that have received transport of hydrogen from Bodø. So the main takeaway here is that centralized production of hydrogen is cost effective compared to local production. Maybe not surprising, but of course you need to have a somewhat dense market in order to make this fly. And the other takeaway, if you look also here next to this different dots, you can see a number numbers in brackets, and these are just indicating that's an identifier of the different connections that use the refueling points. And you can see here for several of these dots, there are many numbers in one bracket, so which means that the model also opts for co-utilization of refueling points. So not only economies of scale in terms of production, large-scale production, but also co-utilization of hydrogen refueling points in order to have a more efficient value chain. So these are the two takeaways from this picture. However, another interesting discussion also from the policy side is, of course, what will this cost? So we have looked here at the abatement cost measured in. So basically what we do is to optimize the system for conventional vessels without any emission reduction requirements. And we run the model also with the scenario where we require emission reduction. And we compare the costs. So you can see that, and then in this chart, each line represents the abatement costs for a given connection in Nordland, again indicated by these numbers. So you can see very easily from this chart that in some cases where you have very short connection and you can use battery-powered vessels, the abatement cost could even become negative. But in the general case, the abatement costs are very high, much higher on average, and in general, much higher than the 2,000 krone per ton. That is sort of the social costs of carbon into 2030 announced by the Norwegian government. So in general, this zero emission transition is very costly. We have also done several robustness checks regarding these results. These are our main results, but in general, this holds also for different kinds of sensitivity tests. So with that, I'll just conclude that when we model and have undertaken this scenario analysis for the high-speed services in Nordland, we find in general that battery-powered vessels are, of course, preferred. They're also more known technology, more mature perhaps than the hydrogen technology. But in general, if you want to have this full-fledged transition to zero emission everywhere, as the new requirement suggests, you need to think about hydrogen as a solution. And we think it's important if you want to introduce hydrogen, it must be cost effective. So you need to think about the value chain and where can you exploit economies of scale, maybe not only in production, but also in consumption of hydrogen. And how can end users also change their behavior in order to have a more efficient value chain. And finally, our findings suggest that abatement costs, especially for these high-speed ferries, are very high. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Very interesting presentation. Don't be shy to raise a question or two to Kenneth in the chat, and he will answer that at the end of this webinar. In the final presentation for today, we have Linda Agevik Ellingsen. She will present about environmental sustainability of transport technologies. This will be the final presentation for this webinar. So, Linda Agevik, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jonas. I will start this presentation by having a general look at emissions from transport technologies, here exemplified by the passenger car. When we consider emissions from conventional transport technologies, we often tend to focus on the emissions stemming from combustion of fuels. These are what we refer to as direct emissions. When we take this perspective and look at electric transport technologies, of course, we find that there are no emissions, and so these transport technologies are often referred to as zero emission technologies. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no emissions associated with electric transport technologies. It's just that these occur upstream or downstream of the use phase, and these are what we refer to as indirect emissions. And of course, all transport technologies have these emissions. It's just that these are not very obvious, and it requires a system perspective to capture these. To do that, we use a life cycle assessment. LCA is widely recognized as the best framework for assessing the potential environmental impacts of different products and services. And at TUI, we are using LCA in a few different projects. Of course, in HyValue, in the work package 6, where we are considering hydrogen. And then we have BALSA, which is a Horizon 2020 project where we are assessing a new type of battery. It's a bio-based lithium-ion battery. And then we have FAME that Ingrid already mentioned, where we are assessing maritime propulsion systems and their energy carriers. In SELECT, which is a very ambitious project from the life cycle perspective, and that is because we are going to consider the entire Norwegian car fleet. And not only that, we are also considering circular economy aspects. So we will be assessing the environmental sustainability of, for instance, reusing spent e-car batteries. And finally, we have Moses, where we are doing LCA of different transport technologies. The first study we did was on larger passenger vehicles. And then we considered different battery electric city buses where different lithium-ion battery technologies and sizes were used. And currently, we are working on a LCA study of semi-trailer trucks. And this study is particularly relevant for HyValue as we are considering hydrogen fuel cells as one of the technologies. And we are going to have a look at this case study. Before we look at the results from the study, we are going to have a look at what's considered. And the study is performed as a cradle to grave study. So that means we are considering the entire life cycle. And that consists of the equipment life cycle as well as the energy life cycle. And these two combined make up the complete life cycle. The equipment life cycle is everything that has to do with the vehicles themselves. So this includes everything from material extraction through equipment manufacturing and vehicle assembly and distribution of the vehicles. And during operation, we consider maintenance needs and finally the end of life treatment. The other life cycle is the energy life cycle, and this is often referred to as well-to-wheel. Here we consider well-to-tank, which is energy resource extraction and production and distribution of energy carriers. And then we have what's called tank-to-wheel, and that is the energy conversion on board the vehicle. And so we see that the operation is a very small part of the complete life cycle, but of course also important. Having a look at the results, I have emphasized that these are the preliminary results, as this is an ongoing case study, although the results that we are going to have a look at are not likely to change a lot. In the case study, we consider 3 different powertrain technologies. We consider diesel in internal combustion engines. We look at hydrogen fuel cell trucks, and finally, battery electric trucks. And this study is performed as a hypothetical case study for Norway. And so for the diesel truck, we considered the diesel, which is a blend of both fossil diesel and biodiesel. And based on statistics for Norway in 2021, we estimated a 14% share of biodiesel, and that includes both HVO and FAME. For the fuel cell trucks, we consider green hydrogen produced through electrolysis using wind power. And finally, for the battery truck, we consider charging using the Norwegian consumption mix. So that's what's physically available in Norway when we consider production, imports, and exports. When we do an LCA, we often consider multiple environmental impact categories. Here, we're going to have a look at the preliminary results for climate change emissions. And these will be reported in terms of gram CO2 equivalents per ton kilometer on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the different powertrain technologies. And I'm going to go through the contribution of life cycle emissions step by step. I'm going to have to go through a little bit quick, but hopefully it will give some interesting insights. Starting with production, which includes everything pertaining to the production and delivery of the trucks themselves. So everything from material extraction through assembly of the vehicles and delivery of these. We see that the electric powertrains have quite higher emissions compared to the conventional diesel truck. And for the battery truck, this is primarily due to battery production. This is a very big battery. It's a 600 kilowatt hour battery, and it weighs nearly 4 tons. So that adds up to production emissions. For the fuel cell, the higher emissions primarily stem from 2 sources, and that's the fuel cell systems as well as the hydrogen tanks. And it's perhaps a bit surprising that the hydrogen tanks contribute so significantly, but that is because these are made of carbon fiber, which is very energy intensive to produce, and that causes high emissions. Next, we're going to look at the well-to-tank emissions associated with the energy carriers. So that's everything that has to do with the production and delivery of the energy carriers. And here the results flip around, where the battery has the lowest emissions associated with the energy carrier. The emissions for the hydrogen fuel cell are somewhat higher than that of the battery, and that is because production of hydrogen through electrolysis is very energy intensive, and also because the fuel cells are not as energy efficient as the batteries, so they have a bit higher emissions there. And then we're going to have a look at the tank to wheel emissions. So those are emissions associated with operation and conversion of energy on board the vehicles. And here, of course, we find that only the diesel trucks have these emissions, as these are direct emissions. And this is a quite substantial source to the life cycle emissions for conventional vehicles. Next, we're going to have a look at the indirect emissions associated with maintenance. And we find here that these are quite small. It considers replacement of tires, fluids, and for the fuel cell trucks, also consider one replacement of fuel cell stacks. Based on the hours of operation in this case study, we estimated that one replacement would be needed for the fuel cell. So that's why they have slightly higher maintenance emissions compared to the other two. We also considered replacement of batteries, but based on both cycle life and calendar life, we found that it wasn't necessary for the considered operation in this case study. And finally, we have emissions associated with end-of-life treatment. These are also quite small, a little bit higher for the battery due to the battery recycling. Now, if we look at the complete life cycle emissions here, we see that both of the electric powertrains have significantly lower emissions compared to the conventional diesel truck. Of course, part of this is because we have chosen energy carriers, hydrogen and electricity, that are very green in a way, and that they have a very low carbon intensity. So to consider the energy carrier production and how sensitive the results are to this, we've done a sensitivity analysis, and this also allows for greater transferability of the results to other areas outside of Norway. Here we consider two alternative production routes for hydrogen, gray and blue, and for electricity we consider the average European electricity mix as an example of a more carbon intensive electricity. And with these energy carriers now, we find that the life cycle emissions are substantially higher. So the production of the energy carriers are very important for the overall environmental performance of the electric powertrains. And we see that if we are using gray hydrogen, there is still a small benefit, but it's significantly lower now than it was when we were using even blue, and definitely when we were using green hydrogen. There's a lot more I could say about these results, but I'm going to start rounding off this presentation. So we have seen that the electric trucks, they offer a significant environmental benefit in terms of climate change, particularly when we are using cleaner energy sources. And we've also seen that there is a little bit of a problem shifting with the electric trucks, in that the use phase emissions have gone down at the cost of higher production emissions. It works out okay in this case because the energy carriers, the entire life cycle emissions are still lower. But we also have a different kind of problem shifting. I haven't shown that in the results here, but we find it in the study, and that is that when we're looking at a wider range of different environmental impacts, we find that there is problem shifting, that we are solving one environmental problem by creating another. And we find that for the electric powertrains that the lower climate change emissions comes at a cost of higher environmental impact in other categories, such as ecosystem toxicity. And when we look at all of these different powertrains, we see that there are benefits and disadvantages for all of them. And so we have an environmental trade-offs, and this holds true for all of them. The life cycle perspective, it allows us to identify challenges, but also improvement opportunities in very complex and global supply chains. And so it's a very powerful tool, and the environmental understanding that we get from these kind of analysis is very important for making informed decisions. And that was everything I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. then we have come to the end of the official program. I would like to thank all the presenters from TØI for very interesting and insightful presentations. We have 2 questions in the chat, and I would like to just take them quickly. First question is to Linda. Could you please explain a bit the units, gram CO2 equivalents per time kilometer, something like that? And the second is it considered the different weights of the trucks and capacities to carry a load?
Okay. Yeah, so when we talk about climate emissions, these are often measured in gram CO2 equivalents. I assume that most are familiar with this phrase. So when we are reporting them in gram CO2 equivalents per ton kilometers, we have normalized it to the freight and distance that is being carried. So in the study, we assume that the trucks on average, and this kind of answers the second question, that all of them on average carry a load of 16 ton. We have not considered any differences in the capability of doing that for the different trucks, even though the battery trucks are particularly a little bit heavier. But so we have just considered the average weight, and that is considered in addition to the total mileage, which was considered to be 800,000 kilometers based on an annual mileage of 100,000 kilometers and an operation time of 8 years. So you could say that the complete emissions for these vehicles have been distributed per kilometer with freight that is being carried. I hope that is clear. Otherwise, I'm happy to try to answer this in a better way through email. So if it wasn't, if the person who asked this didn't find it clear, just send me an email.
Thank you, Linda. The last question is from Gunnar Eskeland to Kenneth. How much does cost fall with co-users? What is distance at which batteries becomes useless or unpractical?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I was trying to look at the first question, just frantically browsing through our previous study. And I think at some point we were talking about implementing this sensitivity test where we kind of did not allow for co-utilization of refueling infrastructures. But I could not find it in the document, so I have to look a bit further. But I can send you this master thesis, Gunnar, so and also some more information. We have also done several other studies looking into battery-powered vessels, and our take on this has been that okay, so maybe the range in general is not very long in general for these vessels, but with better planning, you can sort of increase or mitigate some of these problems. So, and that's also what happens in real life, also with the planning of this first zero or battery-powered high-speed vessels in Rogaland. They had to change the timetabling for this vessel in order to find time for charging of the vessels. So I think so our take on this is that of course you have range limitation with these vessels that could be very pronounced, that they're really not suitable for most connections in Norway because most are long and very complex. However, if you plan these services better to find time for refueling, and maybe so in principle our take on this is that there's a trade-off. On the one hand, if you want to maintain the same timetabling as before, it could become very costly because instead of having just one vessel, say, you need to have 2 or 3 vessels to perform the same operations as before. But then, okay, you can say that, but in general, there are costs for passengers if you give them a poorer service, and you really need to trade off the costs of the operators and the cost of the passengers when you make these decisions. So I'm not sure whether that was a very clear answer, but I think our take is that in order to kind of improve the feasibility of these battery-powered vessels, maybe you need to plan things in a different way than what you're currently doing.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. So then we are at the end of this webinar. We are out of time. I want to again thank the entire great team at Institute of Transport Economics who helped me putting all this together. And as I said in the beginning, the recording of this webinar will be posted on HyValue.no shortly after the webinar is over. And there you can also find the previous recorded webinars in this series. So our next webinar in this series is scheduled to February 6th. Then it will be the Norwegian School of Economics and NHH going to host this seminar in relation to HyValue. So don't forget us on the February 6th. Thank you everybody for today and wish you a great weekend and goodbye.